Hello, welcome to Book Reviews and Recommendations, Classics for Kids. So last week I did a little video about recommending classic stories for adults. This year I thought I could do one that people can it can either be read by older kids, probably about middle grade to teenager, independently, or they can also be read out loud as a family. I do want to just say a quick word on that, in that reading aloud to your children, even older children that can read independently, is a great way to not only spend time as a family, but it's also a great way to build vocabulary. It's a great way to build ideas through context, concepts through context. So don't discount, the idea of reading out loud just because your kids can maybe read independently on their own. Excuse me. So these are some recommendations for some classic literature. These are open source. So again, the copyright has expired, with the exception of one of them, and you'll know which one it is when I pull it up. But they are available on the OWL digital library, which is owwl.overdrive.org. So if you go to the digital library, you can find these. Some of them you do need to take a copy out, and you might have to wait and put it on hold. But most of them have no limit on the number of people that can take them out at one time. So I'm going to start with probably the oldest book on my list, which is Gullivers Travels. This was published in 1726, originally by Jonathan Swift. Apparently, I didn't realize this, at the time that this was published, this was actually a satire of what England was doing at the time. It was more for adults, basically. It was supposed to be a sort of tongue-in-cheek critique of the government. How this fits into children's literature, though, is that because of the episodic nature of Gulliver's adventures and the fantastical things that happens to him, it has since become considered a children's story. For example, his very first adventure is in the land of Lilliput, in which he wakes up and he's been tethered to the ground by some people that are only 6 inches tall. So he is a giant in these lands, and he has to, get these people to not think that he's there to crush them or take them over. The next place that he goes, because he doesn't just go from adventure to adventure. There is time in between in which he returns home, and then he goes out on another adventure. Like, for example, the second one, in that one, he is the small person, and he's in the land of giants. So it's very episodic, in that he goes from one adventure to the next to the next. So you can read them in chunks, basically. There's several chapters to each place that he goes. So if you want to, read this out loud to your children, you can do it in sort of episodes. You can do it in chunks, because, like, here's his first voyage right there. This is all the chapters. So if you want to read a chapter or two at a time, you can do that. I will say that, being the oldest one on my list, I did find the language a little dry. I did find it a little bit hard to get into at first, but it is a great way, though, to explore some vocabulary that maybe your children aren't familiar with, or maybe you're not familiar with, and it is worth the read. It is a fun book. At one point he goes to a land of talking horses and things like that. So I would recommend at least giving Gulliver's Travels a look. I don't have a similar suggestion for every one of these, but for this one, I did have a companion suggestion. If you were looking for something that was maybe a bit more exciting, or you were looking for something that was maybe for older readers, like teen, young adult, in the similar vein of an episodic adventure of a man far from home, and that would be the Odyssey by Homer. This is technically an epic poem, handed down in the oral tradition of Greek storytelling and telling of myths. If you're not familiar, this is the story of a man named Odysseus, who is the king of an island called Ithaca. He is returning home from the Trojan War. There is another story called the Iliad, which is about the Trojan War. I actually have not read the Iliad, but I've read the Odyssey several times. So Odysseus and his men are sailing home after the Trojan War. They end up in a land with some cyclopses in which they have to trick their way out to survive the cyclopses. And then Odysseus falls prey to that sort of fatal flaw of seems like nearly every Greek hero, which is hubris, which is excessive pride. And as they're sailing away, he taunts the Cyclops that he is blinded, telling him who he is and how he's the greatest, basically. And Cyclopses are the children of the sea god Poseidon. So the Cyclops calls upon his father to curse Odysseus or to avenge him. And since Odysseus and his men are sailing home on a ship on the sea, this doesn't work out for them. Odysseus ends up lost at sea, going from place to place, from one harrowing event to the other for 20 years. In between, you do also see what's going on in his home of Ithaca with his wife Penelope and his son. Penelope, the castle, the stronghold has been overrun by suitors that want to marry Penelope and become king, and get her to admit that her husband is dead, he's not coming home. And she very cleverly tricks these suitors into waiting until eventually the culmination of the story comes together. There are many versions of this, since there is no real official version. Some of them are a little more involved than others. Some of them are a little drier than others. So if you are going to read this to kids, you might want to just look around and get one that's a little more straightforward, whereas this one is quite long and in depth and a little dry at times. I got this one from a college class, so but is definitely worth a look, and it's a great way to get kids into mythology. So my next recommendation is definitely a little shorter, not as involved, and a little closer to home. That would be The Legend of Sleepy Hollow by Washington Irving. You probably are at least passingly familiar with this story. It is the story of a school teacher named Ichabod Crane, who wants to woo or court a local, I think she's a nobleman's daughter, but a young lady of fairly good, family reputation in the town. There is a rival for her affections in this character, Braun. It's fairly short story. It's fairly straightforward. This is actually a collection of several short stories. So the story itself is only that long. It's a nice short story. But, and that night, as Ichabod is coming home from a party, he is chased down the road by what appears to be a headless horseman, holding a flaming pumpkin for a head. So it's all very, it's got that great feel of a classic sort of ghost story. And Washington Irving is considered to be one of the original American authors, because he was born after the Revolutionary War. And at the time, American authors weren't well recognized throughout the world for their talent, and he was one of the first to really garner recognition overseas. And it was kind of the beginning of the old, European nations sort of realizing that there's quite a bit of writing talent coming out of the Americas. Another tale that you might also be familiar with that's even shorter, that's worth a look, that one's only this long. It's just a little short guy. Is Rip Van Winkle. That is the tale of a man in the takes place. Oh, the other thing is these take place in upstate New York. Sleepy Hollow is an actual town in, I believe it is Westchester County, I think. Whereas Rip Van Winkle takes place in the Catskills, it is the story of a sort of henpecked husband who, believes his wife is nagging him. He goes out to the woods, supposedly to go hunting, where he comes across a group of ornately dressed men playing this game of 9 pins, which is like a type of bowling game. And they are drinking some sort of, liquor or ale, and he partakes of this, and he falls asleep, and he wakes up, and he's very confused, only to discover he has been asleep for 20 years. What's fun about these stories is that they mix the older traditions of Dutch fairy tales with the new lands of America and the sort of mysticism of places like the Catskills. The idea of Rip Van Winkle going through the woods and coming across what appears to be some fairies or some sort of magical beings drinking their wine or their ale and losing time is a very familiar trope in fairy tale stories. So it's fun because it's not fairy tales like grim fairy tales like the originals that were very gruesome. In these ones, like not really to give you away the ending, but in The Legend of Sleepy Hollow, it's highly suggested that the Headless Horseman was actually Bronn, tricking Ichabod into running away. So it doesn't, if you've seen the Tim Burton movie that came out, a while ago, it's nothing like that really. That had a passing resemblance to it. It's not gruesome and graphic, but it is sort of like that just that shade of like a little sort of spooky ghost story. So it is a fun tale to sort of read on a dark night and sit together with the family. So that is the second one that I had, written in a similar vein along the same time for another suggestion. And this is another poem. If you wanted to also sort of weave this into some of the schooling right now, along the same lines as that is, I have here The Midnight Ride of Paul Revere by Henry Wadsworth Longfellow. This is a long poem about Paul Revere, warning, that the British are coming, obviously, during the American Revolution, but written along the same time as Washington Irving was writing. Washington Irving also, as I said, being one of the original American authors, his name, Washington, he's named after George Washington, but Henry Wadsworth Longfellow was one of his contemporaries, and he wrote this epic poem about the midnight ride, of Paul Revere. So that's another one that I would suggest too, that can be found, pretty quickly, just through a search online. My next recommendation is getting more into the science fiction side of things, with the man who's considered to be the father of science fiction is Jules Verne. Here I have 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea. This was originally published in 1869. And like I said, Jules Verne is often credited as being the father of science fiction. He himself, at the time that he wrote these, did not consider them to be rooted in science. He said that he wrote his stories basically, he would get an idea that he wanted to write, and he wanted to write depictions of the earth and at the same time, right, with a very high ideal of beauty of style. Um, he also did have a knack or a habit of sort of writing down the things that he read, so that nonfiction things that he read. So if he did come across something in a like that was talking about the science at the time, he would just write it down. So he did end up sort of weaving the speculative science of the 1800s with these fantasy tales of things that he just wanted to explore. Like in this case, this is exploring, under the sea. At the time, submarines did exist. They were just very primitive. Whereas in the case of this book, the basic story is that there is a marine biologist tasked with investigating what people think is a large sea monster, only to discover that it is actually an advanced submarine called the Nautilus, captained by Captain Nemo, a man who has just decided to kind of forego life on land and to explore under the ocean. And then what follows is them going to various places and seeing, fantastical sights and fantastical beasts like the colossal squid. And it's just sort of that tale of vivid imagination. A lot of what he has written sort of has since, or at least parts of it, at least seem to have mimicked maybe some, what's the word I'm looking for? I'm sorry, a little tired this morning, so my brain's not quite functioning as well as I'd like it to. Get some more coffee there. But some of the things have come to pass. We have made advancements in, from where we were with say submarines at the time to where we are now, then would have seemed like feats of amazement and impossibility. But I just think it's interesting that that's not what Jules Verne actually set out to do. He just wanted to write these sort of places he wanted to see, and then fit the mechanism for how to do that to the story. For example, in his book, Around the World in 80 Days, he says he wanted to explore Africa. And the only way he could think to do that is from above in a hot air balloon. So it's not that he set out to say like, wow, let's write this story about, this fantasy story, or this science fiction story about pushing the bounds of science. It was more that he was just exploring his own imagination, and his tales have stood the test of time. So in recommendation along with, say, 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea, I would just actually recommend the other classics by Jules Verne, which is Journey to the Center of the Earth and Around the World in 80 Days. Very similar in vein, in which he takes a premise, like in this case, drilling down into the center of the earth, and along the way, some amazing, fantastical things happen to the main characters. So they're just a lot of fun. They are, they're not, since they're not based in science and they're not based in trying to predict the future of science, they're not as heavy, I think, as some people think they are. They're much more light and fun than that. So those are definitely great for anyone who likes science fiction, and with a sort of fantasy element to it. All right, so my next one, this is the one that is still under copyright, so you either do have to take out a copy from the library. You might have to wait if people have it out right now. But it is, I couldn't have this list without it, basically, is The Hobbit by J.R.R. Tolkien. The Hobbit is a fantasy story about a hobbit, which are sort of little people with hairy feet who live in these hobbit holes, and they don't have adventures. They like their home bodies, they like to stay home. And for all of us right now who are having to stay home, this is a nice departure, because a wizard named Gandalf comes along and kind of sends Bilbo on this adventure, whether he wants it or not. The overall tale, in a nutshell, is basically that Bilbo goes with a company of dwarves to win a share of treasure from the dragon Smog, who is guarding the treasure. There's obviously, being Tolkien, there's a lot more to it than that, but that's kind of the fun of it along the way. This is also told in the format of an episodic adventure, much like Gulliver's Travels or the Odyssey, in which the characters go from event to event or from meeting a particular person or creature, and it sort of moves on without necessarily a lot of continuity between one episode and the next. But that's kind of fun when you're reading, especially to younger audiences, that each chapter is almost its own thing, and you can, I mean, they do connect, but it's, you know, you can kind of go from thing to thing, and each one is almost like a little story in and of itself. I'm just looking at my notes here to see if I missed anything. What is nice about this too is, since Bilbo does go from being a sort of homebody and thinking that he doesn't want to have adventures to having this grand adventure, is he does change along the way. He, you know, gets more confident. He gets more worldly, more wisdom, which is nice for kids in that it shows that, you know, that increasing in levels of maturity and competence and what people can do when they go from their sort of home life to out in the wider world. So it's a great book for kids because not only does it have that really fun story, it's got dwarves and elves and dragons and, you know, all the fantasy elements, but it does have a story at its heart that kids can really latch onto. I don't have a visual for the next part because I actually don't own it. I haven't read it. I know, blasphemy. I've read this one, but obviously I'm going to recommend for older readers would be the Lord of the Rings trilogy by J.R.R. Tolkien. So if you're looking for something that maybe teens can read, you know, that sort of older middle grade to teen, or even if you're looking for something to read as adults, I would definitely recommend the Lord of the Rings trilogy. It just gets a little more, you know, things kind of start in here with the ring, and then the Lord of the Rings trilogy is just a little more mature, basically as a group of heroes try to get this ring, evil ring, keep it out of the hands of the bad guy, which is a very short, very missing a lot synopsis of it, but it's sort of a classic tale, so I don't think I need to say much on it. Oh, I will say about The Hobbit though is, I'm not going to get into any sort of film critique, but I would say please don't judge the book on the movies that came out a few years ago, where they made 3 movies out of one short book. They don't, I wouldn't really judge what's in here by what is in the movies. That's not to say the movies were good or bad, just that, I mean, obviously they had to make 3 movies out of one children's novel. So things maybe got embellished or, yeah. So for my last real in-depth recommendation, and this one maybe is for a little bit of older readers, is The Adventures of Sherlock Holmes by Sir Arthur Conan Doyle. Anyone who's not familiar, Sherlock Holmes is often, people think he's the first detective character in literature. He's not actually the first, he's just the most well-known. Some people also think, because he is so prevalent, is that he must have been a real person, and he's not, he's a fictional character. So The Adventures of Sherlock Holmes were originally published in serial format around 1892. This book contains 12 short stories of cases. They're written from the perspective of Watson, Dr. Watson, Holmes's sort of assistant that goes along with him, and I'm sure people would take umbrage with the fact I'm calling him his assistant, his friend, and his sort of companion there, Dr. Watson. What I think is funny is that since Watson is the one writing the stories down, and these are both fictional characters, apparently Holmes actually takes a little issue with his recounting of them, saying that they are sort of sensationalized and popularized for more general reading, and that it doesn't really capture the logic and the science behind what they do when they solve these cases. So I just thought that was funny because it's this little meta take on a fictional character critiquing how his stories are being told. But as you can probably realize, is Sherlock Holmes is considered one of the great detective characters, one of the greatest ever written. Each story is its own case, so you can kind of read them case by case, story by story. I think some people have the mistaken idea that all of his cases are murder cases, and that's not true. He does solve a lot of different cases for a lot of different clients. He is considered a consulting detective, so he, works for many exotic clients as well as maybe, the London Police Department. But so basically, it's just a lot of fun for anyone who likes mysteries, who likes detective work. The character's very known for his powers of observation and deduction. There's also some forensic science and, his logical reasoning, which is almost taken to a unreal level. He's almost like the superhero of detectives. Maybe if you want to stretch it a little bit, but maybe if you have some kids that like Batman, because he's considered to be great, is considered to be a detective, kind of start with the original of Sherlock Holmes. I actually don't have a companion suggestion for this. I don't know why. It's just kind of, he's his own thing. But yeah, so basically, if you want to get into that sort of mystery, if you want to have that sort of trying to deduce where the case is going, I would recommend The Adventures of Sherlock Holmes. So those are kind of it for my main synopses of recommendations. I do have a few that I couldn't really fit in, otherwise I'd be talking forever. But I do have a few honorable mentions here. So if you are looking for more things to read, or maybe things for younger audiences, sorry, I got all my stuff over here. Some things that I'll just go over very quickly that are always good classics, that are always, crowd pleasers. For younger kids, you can always start with Aesop's fables. These are little, sometimes they are, you can see incredibly short, like that's a story right there. And this is its own story over here. So they are very short. They are all tales involving usually animals that have a moral. So they're all those little morality tales that kind of help kids understand the world around them, and also, talking animals. So it's a lot of fun. And they're very short, so they're very easy to read. You can read several of them. I would also recommend, if you're looking for something to read aloud or to read with your kids, you don't need this copy, but any sort of world mythology, any sort of classic tales of myth and legend, kids absolutely love. My kids right now, we're reading the Percy Jackson series, and they actually really love hearing about the tales behind, these characters that these popular characters are coming across. So, and don't just limit yourself to say Greek or Roman mythology. there are many amazing tales from all over the entire world. I only just really recently realized how much I like Norse mythology. Also anything from, the India, from Asia. They have some amazing mythology. So I would recommend that. Pretty easy to find just by searching through the internet. And in that same vein, fairy tales are also, very popular. With fairy tales, sometimes it's hit or miss because some of the older ones are a bit more gruesome, whereas the newer, versions have been sort of sanitized for children. And that one's really up to you as the parent, how far you want to go with that. So I will leave that up to you. But again, also, it's pretty easy to find these sort of large collections and just read a couple of stories at a time. But fairy tales definitely still have a purpose in popular, culture. They do have that resonance. Same thing with mythology, it has that resonance that continues through that sort of archetypal lessons. So I wouldn't discount, just your classic fairy tales. For some longer stories that are always, don't sort of lose their popularity, there's always Alice in Wonderland. The sort of absurd, nonsensical tale of a girl that falls down a rabbit hole and goes to a sort of loopy world where people don't make sense. And again, very episodic. Lewis Carroll, claims that he was just trying to write basically nonsense. But I find that it does have that sort of resonance with the older tales, like, say, the Odyssey or Gullivers Travels, in which it has that sort of episodic narrative to it. Each chapter is its own different sort of meeting of a different person or creature or little slice in time sort of adventure. So usually it comes with also Alice Through the Looking Glass. So there's actually two stories to Alice in Wonderland. Peter Pan by J.M. I don't know if it's Barrie. I believe it's Barrie. B-A-R-R-I-E. Peter Pan by J.M. Barrie. This is a pop-up book that's seen better days. That's why there's something sticking out the side. The tale of the darling children, Wendy and her two brothers, that are taken to Neverland by a boy, although really in the original version he's I don't know actually if he's a boy that doesn't grow up or if he's supposed to be some sort of sprite or spirit. But they're taken to Neverland where Peter Pan never grows up, and they come across all those sort of child adventures, that kids sort of dream about, pirates and crocodiles and this fairies and all those sorts of things. So also has a great message about children and coming home and things like that. So some of the most beautiful writing I've ever seen. It really is a very whimsical, the sentences in and of themselves really blew me away on this one. So I would definitely recommend Peter Pan. Along with Alice in Wonderland and Peter Pan, you have to, of course, include The Wizard of Oz by L. Frank Baum. Again, the story of a girl who is swept up in this time in a tornado and ends up in this fantastical world of Oz. Of course, in this one, little Dorothy Gale is trying to get home. So I will say that this is not entirely similar to the movie, the classic movie. There's certain things in common, a little girl getting swept up in a tornado and taken to this land where she is given a pair of magic slippers and told to follow the yellow brick road to the Emerald City. There she is told for the wizard to help her, she needs to vanquish the Wicked Witch of the West. That's about, you know, that's about where the similarities sort of end. The actual adventures along the way are a little different in the story than the ones we see in the movie, but still a lot of fun. I will say that her slippers are silver and not ruby. The ruby slippers for the movie were because the red really showed up on the new Technicolor film. So it's a little bit of trivia for you. Also, the Emerald City is not green. Crazy. But those are the two things that just to warn you about, because people are going to be like, wait, what? So always a classic, always a fan favorite with kids. And the last thing is Treasure Island by Robert Louis Stevenson. The classical tale of swashbuckling pirates and buried treasure. It follows a cabin boy named Jim Hawkins when he is not so much given, I guess that's not really the right word, but he comes across a treasure map to a man that's staying at the inn that he works at, and then Jim and a crew of what appear this sort of upstanding officers that are looking for the treasure versus these pirates that are going to mutiny to take the treasure map and get the treasure for themselves. So it's just, you know, that sort of classic adventure swashbuckling tale. Always a crowd pleaser, you know, always a fan favorite. Just recently, my kids and I actually watched the Muppets version of it, which I always find a lot of fun. So this is also great to sort of go back to the original and read aloud. So that is it. Those are all my recommendations for if you're sitting at home, if you're a little bored and you want to sort of find a way to help pass the time for your kids. I would say if you're reading aloud, I would say you could start, most of these you could start as early as 7. You know, obviously use your own discretion with your own children, but I would say about 7. You know, for a lot of these, you could start at that age. And then, you know, if you have older children or teenagers, some of these, you know, classics they can read on their own, and they'll probably be surprised that they really enjoy it, particularly like the Lord of the Rings or the Odyssey. But yeah, so I hope that this was helpful to you. I hope that it gave you at least maybe some new things to look into, some new ways to kind of break up the boredom. I don't know what kind of recommendations I might do next. If you have any suggestions, please email us at the Maston Public Library. And I hope you all are having a great, healthy day. I hope you're at least getting out, maybe taking some walks, maybe. And when I say getting out, I just mean getting outside, getting out into, you know, at least we have some sunshine today. It's still a little chilly. You know, to really sort of stave off that boredom and that being inside the house. But I hope that you're all doing well, and I will see you next week.